Society. So it's my duty this afternoon to welcome you to this event, and in particular to welcome our speaker for today, Chris Shaw. Says he, picking up his crib sheet. Chris Shaw has worked for ARM, the chip design company, for 15 years, and for the last 14 years he's been responsible for ARM's customer training activity, and so he has given many hundreds of lectures over those years, so he's certainly no stranger to a podium. He has had for a long time a fascination with Colossus, and he's studied Colossus and the design of it, the people who used it. And it's that aspect of Colossus that he's talking about today. So, Chris, can I thank you for coming, welcome you to the meeting, and invite you to give us your lecture. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you. It's absolutely fantastic to see so many people here. So not having enough space is definitely the right problem to have. And I am seriously impressed with any organisation that can get through an AGM in less than 20 minutes. It shows you have your priorities right, you've got more important things to do. I'm very impressed. A few years ago, I lived in Cambridge for over 30 years now. Some years ago, in one of the churches in Cambridge, I heard a speaker comment that he didn't feel so much like Daniel in the lion's den as a rather small lion in a den of Daniels. And I have to say that's the way I feel here. I feel extremely underqualified to talk about the history of computing. For me, it's a hobby. For many of you, it has been and perhaps still is a job of work and something you've made a career out of. For me, it is something, a hobby, and something that fascinates me. As Roger mentioned, I'm fortunate enough to work at ARM and have been for nearly 16 years now, where I work with a certain Tim Hartley, whose surname you may recognise bears a striking resemblance to your very own David Hartley. And I think that's possibly the connection that brings me here. And it's a great honour to be here. But anyway, to Colossus. Now, knowing this group and knowing your interests and knowing what you do, I am absolutely sure that all of you know about Colossus. I'm pretty sure that most of you, if not all of you, would have been to Bletchley and seen it. Perhaps some of you even were lucky enough to have been involved in rebuilding it and putting it all back together again. So you know of its origins, you know of some of the names associated with it. The existence of Colossus, yes, has been in the public domain, rightly or wrongly, officially or unofficially, for about 20 years now, possibly slightly longer. And its existence sort of got suddenly more official about 15 years ago. But surprisingly little is still known about it. And I think outside certain circles, very few people know much about what it was and what it did. And there is even material in the National Archive on Colossus and on the research associated with it, which still remains classified. So what I tried to do in putting this talk together, which I've given at various locations, is to try and put Colossus in context. And there are all kinds of contexts here. Obviously, there is a historical context. And there's the context of wartime, there's the context of Bletchley and a war to be won. So we put it in that context. And there's a personal context as well. There are a lot of fascinating personal stories associated with Colossus and its development. We don't have time to go into all of them, but I hope to introduce you to some of the people who designed it, who built it, who operated it, and so on. And the context of events, its effect on subsequent events in history, subsequent the way that the war turned out, and so on. And also its technical context. Its genesis in the technology of its time, if you like, and its effect on the immediate post-war developments and subsequent developments in electronic computing, which I think have been understated for years. But what's hardest to uncover, for me at least, has been the details of what it was actually built to do. What was the problem that it was designed to solve? What did all its circuits do? And I found researching into that at times incredibly frustrating. A lot of very old papers which have been since collected by people like Jack Copeland and so on, but written in a very disjointed way, and trying to synthesize that and work out exactly really what Colossus was built to do and distill that into a sort of layman's description, if you like, of what it did was a bit frustrating, to be honest, but absolutely fascinating. So at the end of an hour, my goal is that you miss out on the frustration and you catch, I hope, the fascination that many of us, myself included, have with Colossus. So to Colossus itself. Colossus, in context, connects a country house halfway between Cambridge and Oxford in England on a railway line that no longer exists. The Battle of the Atlantic, which raged really from right at the beginning of the war, almost right through to its end. A Cambridge mathematician. The Lorenz type SZ42 encrypting teleprinter, which is something that nobody knew about until after the war finished. And a telephone engineer. So Colossus connects all of those. It was built and designed through the second half of 1943, and at the time was certainly the largest and most complex electronic computing machine of its time. It was conceived in total secrecy, and at the end of the war, its memory was deliberately destroyed to protect the secret, and we shall see perhaps how that turned out towards the end. But those who designed it and built it and worked with it changed history in several ways. Firstly, it's estimated and well documented and attested, I think, that Colossus and machines like it shortened the war by anything up to 2 years by many estimates. And that saved, it's easy to do the maths, hundreds and thousands, if not millions of lives. And second, it represented the birth of large-scale electronic computing and arguably founded the industry in which all of us have worked since, and in which many of us, myself included, still work. And it is still today one of the most exciting, fast-changing fields of the 20th and 21st centuries, and one that, say, I feel very privileged to work in. But to tell the story, really, I need to take you back to 1943. That is a map of Europe as of July the 1st, 1943. And the story it tells is a very dark one. You can see Nazi dominion from Stalingrad in the east to the Atlantic coast in the west, and you can see from Norway in the north to the bottom of Italy in the south. And what you can see at the western edge of Europe is Britain really standing alone. And Britain is vital to the Allies' plans, because any re-invasion of that European mainland is going to have to start from Britain, without, if you like, that staging post, that stepping stone, just a few miles from the French coast. Mounting a re-invasion would have been infinitely more difficult and possibly even impossible. And Britain is kept alive through these years, these very dark years of the war, kept alive by a stream of convoys coming across the North Atlantic from North America, from Canada, bringing supplies, men, money, food, munitions, and so on, to keep the war effort going. And raged against those convoys are the wolf packs, the U-boats of the German Kriegsmarine. And at this stage of the war, it is certainly true that the greatest struggle that Britain faces is on sea and not at land. And the Kriegsmarine, as we well know, has been documented for a long time, communicates with its U-boats via radio, and those radio transmissions are encrypted using an Enigma machine, which you can see there. And Enigma is well known about, and it's been known since the early 70s that British codebreakers actually comprehensively broke the Enigma encryption scheme after some fantastic head starts they inherited from Polish intelligence. And Enigma is a wonderful machine in many ways. It's electromechanical, it's battery powered, it's very simple, it's very robust, and very, very easy to use on board a submarine or in a mobile command outpost. You simply set the rotors to a starting position, you press keys, lights light up on the light board, you write them down, you transmit them, and after you've done a character, the wheels move and the encryption scheme changes. So the resulting ciphertext is just transmitted by hand using a standard Morse key. There are just over 17,500 ways of setting up the initial position of the rotors on an Enigma machine, and you can complicate that further, and the Nazis did, including changing the order of the rotors, picking 3 rotors from an available set of 5, and at the front of the machine you can see a plug board which introduced another set of permutations in the encryption scheme. And if you add that, a 10-way plug board became standard towards the end of the war. That introduced the number of possible letter substitutions to something of the order of 100 billion combinations. And used properly, Enigma should really have been completely unbreakable with the technology of the time. But as we know, it wasn't used properly. Here at Bletchley Park, the government established the Government Code and Cipher School, known as Station X, top secret, and assembled a really motley crew. And that's one of the things that fascinates me about Bletchley Park. It really was, in many ways, a motley crew of mathematicians, crossword solvers, linguists, and all kinds of strange people who banded together to monitor, to intercept, to analyse, and to break German codes. And possibly one of the few times in history, certainly recent history, where a group of sort of unqualified but talented amateurs have really changed history. And I think that's one of the fascinations, certainly for me, of Bletchley Park. Associated with that story so far, one figure stands out above all others, and that figure is Alan Turing. He's most associated with the effort against Enigma. Was not particularly associated with Colossus, but was already famous in the mathematical community at the time for his work on computation theory. His paper on the Entscheidungs problem was published in 1936 and really made his name. And in that he introduced this concept of the universal Turing machine, which widely recognised now as the birth of computing theory. And he and the teams that worked for him and with him analysed and comprehensively really destroyed the Enigma encryption scheme. And using machines like this, like the bomb, which I'm sure you've been involved in reconstructing, turned cryptanalysis against Enigma really into an industry. What a bomb is essentially 36 Enigma machines in one chassis, and it's capable of trying out all those possible 17,000 plus settings at an astonishing rate. It takes about 20 minutes to go through all the possible starting positions, and when configured up with a possible menu, it can break up messages, say, within hours. And at Bletchley Park, when they received intercepts, they would break out a day's messages, typically within a few hours. Those would be typed up and sent by courier to Central Intelligence headquarters in London, where they would be analysed. There was a lot of hand analysis involved, but it's really Turing's efforts that did this. By the end of the war, there were over 200 bombs manufactured. The US Navy then went and manufactured over another 200. Ours weighed just about a ton. The US ones weighed 2.5 tons. Don't ask me what extra they put in them, but I suppose they like to make things bigger, not necessarily better. So was it all worth it? So it's a huge effort. Turing is just the face, if you like, the tip of a massive iceberg of teams of people, largely working by hand, through day, through night. At Bletchley Park, I think at peak, something like 15,000 people worked there. So was it all worth it? A huge amount of money. Some of the best minds that Britain had produced engaged in this. Was it worth it? Well, yes, frankly, it was. And here's just one piece of evidence that shows the value that cryptanalysis had. Because being able to read U-boat transmissions allowed the convoy commanders to route their ships away from waiting U-boats, and it allowed the attack groups to be directed to attack those U-boats. There was a period, however, between February and December 1942, when the Kriegsmarine changed their Enigma machine. What they did was introduce a 4th rotor alongside the original 3. That complicated the cryptanalysis task considerably, and it completely locked out Bletchley Park from naval Enigma for about 10 months. And looking at that chart, it is blindingly obvious when that period was. You can see that the blue line there is the tonnage of Allied shipping sunk per month from the beginning of the war to the end. And you can see very obviously when that was. Convoy losses increased from about 150,000 tons, which is bad enough, per month, to over 700,000 tonnes a month in a matter of weeks and remained there for 6 months. It is quite clear that if losses had continued at that rate, the Battle of the Atlantic would have been lost. Britain would almost certainly have starved to death, and the outcome of the war would have been completely different. That is the value of cryptanalysis, and that is why Bletchley Park persevered against huge odds. I'm going to take a little digression now. Having established the value of cryptanalysis, so what is it? Well, I'm going to introduce some terminology, which may be teaching Grandmaster Psychics, I don't know, but anyway. The cryptanalysis 101. The encryption process involves taking a plain text, which we're going to call P, just remember that, because we're going to call it P from now on, and putting it through some kind of an encryption process and resulting in a ciphertext, which we will call Z. And a very simple cipher to illustrate that. Here's an alphabetic substitution cipher. This is very trivial. Julius Caesar used to use these, which is why it's sometimes called a Caesar cipher. He used them in his private correspondence over 2,000 years ago. And very simply, you take the message, you read it in the bottom, and you read the encrypted message off the bottom row. And you can break this relatively simply, given a long enough message, using simple frequency analysis, because the analysis of different letters in the English language, or whichever other language you choose to use, is well known. And using frequency analysis, you can reverse engineer the alphabet. So any serious encryption technique using some kind of substitution is going to go beyond that, and one step beyond that is possibly a polyalphabetic substitution cipher, where we have more than one alphabet, and there's a scheme that uses 3. And here, each successive input character is encrypted using the next alphabet in the sequence. And when you run out of alphabets, you start to reuse them. The beauty of this, as you can see, is that we've got 2 S's in our plain text, and they encrypt to different characters in the ciphertext. And likewise, we've got 2 C's in our ciphertext, but they originate from different characters in the plain text. So you can see this complicates the task considerably, and it makes frequency analysis much harder. But it doesn't make it impossible, because given a long enough message and a guess about how many alphabets there are, you simply divide your ciphertext into a subset of individually encrypted sets of characters, and then use frequency analysis on those and reverse engineer all the alphabets. So it's difficult, it's a lot more difficult. You need a long enough message. Crucially, you need a message which is orders of magnitude longer than the number of alphabets used to carry out the encryption. And this is essentially what Enigma does. The beauty of Enigma, or the horror of Enigma, depending on which way you want to look at it, is it generates a non-repeating sequence of 16,900 alphabets in use. So with a message shorter than that, you can see that frequency analysis is totally defeated and becomes completely useless against this. So machines like the bomb were generated in order to search through that sequence of alphabets, if you like, extremely quickly. So that's Enigma. And an Enigma intercept looked like this. This is a real one from the 10th of March 1943. They would be intercepted at listening stations around the coast by radio operators just listening on headphones, transcribing them onto paper. They'd be then typed up onto sheets like this and sent to Bletchley by courier. Bletchley, they would be analysed, the bombs would be loaded up, the day's settings would be cracked out, the messages would then be decrypted using Enigma replicas or a British Typex machine. And then the results would be analysed and the intelligence then sent again by a motorcycle courier to London for action. But in early 1941, the listeners began to realise that this wasn't the only traffic floating around occupied Europe, and they started to hear messages which looked like this. It's obviously some kind of high-speed automated transmission. It's some kind of electromechanical automatic telegraph, if you like, which is fairly well-known technology. And they devised machines to transcribe this onto ticker tape, as you can see there, with just a moving pen. And then that would be painstakingly transcribed by hand into letters using the International Telegraph alphabet. And for a long time, the teams at Bletchley Park ignored this traffic. They had other fish to fry, they had the war in the Atlantic to win, they had Enigma to deal with, and they had all the problems associated with that. So they really ignored this traffic. But over time, they began to realize perhaps this traffic might be more important than it looked. And they conducted traffic analysis on the networks on which this machinery was used, on which this strange transmission appeared. And by analysing the location, using direction finding technology to analyse the location of transmissions and the direction and the reception of them, they identified this network as being the only network that used this particular scheme. And it's very obvious when you look at it that that network centres on Berlin. That's the first thing you notice about it. The second thing they noticed is that the messages being transferred along these links were very, very long. And they began to dawn on them that this probably was the highest grade traffic in the German war machine. This was traffic from the regional headquarters, the regional outposts of German-occupied Europe back to headquarters in Berlin. This was the highest grade traffic between senior commanders and, yes, most likely the Führer's team himself sitting in Berlin. And really, it had to be broken, if at all possible. So they started to look at it a little bit more closely. And a chap called John Tiltman started to look at it. He was a well-known member of the team at Bletchley Park, who's been involved in many other things. And he established fairly early on that it was called what was called a Vernam cipher. But he was unable to analyse this far enough to do anything about it. So what is a Vernam cipher? Well, it kind of looks like this. You take your plain text, there's our P if you like, and you convert it to standard 5-bit teleprinter code using the standard alphabet. And in fact, the alphabet being used is called International Telegraph Alphabet 2, and it's a very standard code, nothing unusual about that. Then you combine it electromechanically or somehow with a machine-generated 5-bit key stream, and we're going to call that key stream K. And the result is a ciphertext, Z. And the operation used to do that is, well, they called it carryless binary addition. We tend to call it exclusive OR these days. And it's a simple, almost the most simple of the binary operations. And it also works backwards, just like Enigma does. So an operator at one end of the link would set up his machine, transmit the text. He would very often transcribe it onto tape and run the tape through the teleprinter at full speed. That would automatically transmit the data to the receiving machine, which would punch it out on another tape, and that tape would then be run through the decryption engine, set up exactly the same way to generate exactly the same bit stream as the transmitting machine. And because the exclusive OR operation is reversible, out would come the original plaintext. Very simple. So the formula that this is the scheme that Tiltman realised was being used. Just remember that formula at the top. P, E or K equals Z. Plaintext combined with keystream gives you ciphertext. That is how far Tiltman got, and could not really get any further. Until Bletchley Park had a massive stroke of luck. On 31st of August 1941, an operator in Vienna sent a message which did not get through. For some reason, we do not know why. The recipient asked him to send it again. And breaking all the rules, the guy in Vienna reset his machine to the same starting position he'd used before and retyped the message. But he didn't send it exactly the same way. Being bored or tired or fed up or grumpy or both, he used some abbreviations in the second message to shorten his task, just to save a bit of time. So we ended up with two messages. Here they are, ZA and ZB. And these are actually, this is the text that Bletchley Park received and handed over to Tiltman to see what he could do with it. Now he guessed from standard German operating procedures that the first 12 characters were actually the indicator setting of the machine, which turned out to be right. He didn't know how they determined the setting of the machine, but he reasoned that that was what they were. And he did notice that the second message started out the same as the first one, but then relatively quickly it started to diverge. The messages were each over 4,000 characters long, which is obviously something big enough to work with. Now, being a Vernam cipher, Tiltman knew that they were encrypted using the same key string, and in adding the two messages together would actually eliminate the key because of the way the EOR operation works. And what remained would be the two original plain texts added together. So here ZA is obviously plain text A combined with the key, ZB is plain text B combined with the key. If you add these two together, K disappears. You end up with the addition of the two plain texts. He did just that, added them together, and ended up with a lot of zeros, because you get a zero when the two letters are the same. And then it started to diverge when the messages became different. So he would guess at a subsequent character, subtract it from the other message and see if that gave a meaningful character in the other one, and then character by character, word by word, work his way through the message, going back and forth between the two by hand to break these two out. And it took him about 10 days and a huge amount of guesswork to come up with two plain texts, which is what he did, and there they are at the bottom. And you can see exactly what the German operator has done here. The message starts with an indicator sequence and then the word Spruchnummer, which in German means message number. And you can see that in the second one, he couldn't be bothered to type out Spruchnummer completely and just typed out Spruch-NR. And that was the mistake that gave Tiltman the way into the message and the ability to break out the key string. Now, he broke out 4,000 characters of a wonderful message, which by then was probably 3 or 4 weeks old, and in intelligence terms was useless. But what he then realized was that if you added one of these back to the original ciphertext, what you got was the key string. And that was very, very useful. He ended up with 4,000 characters plus, just over 4,000 characters of the original key string. And they looked at that for months, 3 months, and really couldn't make anything out of it. And eventually gave it, possibly almost in desperation, to this man, Bill Tutt. Bill Tutt was another Cambridge mathematician, mathematical chemist, from Trinity this time. So not that I'm keeping score, but Cambridge 2, Oxford 1, Oxford 0 so far. Okay? So they gave him this 4,000 characters of key string and just said, see what you can do with it. And Tutt locked himself away for weeks with a large amount, presumably, of paper and coffee and pencils, and wrote out this key string again and again and again in grids, trying to see if he could find a pattern and find a structure. And astonishingly, he did. And he managed to work out from just 4,000 characters of the key string the entire structure of the Lorenz machine. Now, I say Lorenz machine. Bill Tutt didn't know that such a thing existed. No one in Britain had seen a Lorenz machine or knew it existed or even knew its name until after the war. But without seeing one, Tutt managed to deduce its entire internal structure. And what he determined was it generated its key string using 12 wheels, tooth wheels, a little bit like Enigma. He also managed to work out exactly the number of positions on each wheel and identified that those wheels were in 3 sets. He called the first set the Chi wheels, and they moved every character. And they generated a pseudo-random sequence of 5 bits using pins on the edge of the wheels. A second set of wheels, he called those the Psi wheels, and they didn't move with every character. They moved about half the time. And they generated a second sort of stuttering pseudo-random sequence of 5 bits. And there was a third set of wheels, just 2 wheels, which he called the mu wheels or the motor wheels, and they controlled this stuttering movement of the Psi wheels. This cannot be underestimated. Tutt's feat of analysis is quite incredible. He emigrated to Canada after the war and taught for many years in Canada and was inducted long afterwards as an officer of the Order of Canada. And in that citation, this was cited as one of the greatest intellectual feats of World War II. And I don't think, seriously, anyone would argue with that. So now we can take Tiltman's analysis, or Tiltman's deduction that it was a Vernam cipher, and add that to Tutt's deduction of the internal structure of the machine, and really come up with exactly what was going on. This is what Bletchley Park knew in 1943, after Tiltman and Tutt had finished. They knew that the enciphering process is a two-stage combination using an exclusive OR at both stages, using two 5-bit sequences, one from the chi wheels and a second from the psi wheels. Now the repeat lengths of those sequences are huge. If you look at the positions on those wheels, you can see that they've got a very large number of teeth, very large number of pins, and they're all co-prime. The chi wheels have a repeat length of 22 million characters. The psi wheels have a repeat length of over 320 million characters. Now you combine those together and make the psi wheels stutter, and you end up with a repeat length which is measured in trillions. It is quite astonishingly long, non-repeating sequence. And you realise that to search all possible settings, to reverse engineer P from Z, would take something like 10 to the 19 trials. It is quite staggeringly impossible. Even modern computing technology would struggle with that level of brute force analysis. Even identifying one bit in this would take something like 4 million trials, and that wouldn't help you very much. Now, faced with that, it looks like an almost impossible task, a really almost impossible task. But the Bletchley-Park team, it's not quite clear who noticed this first. Some say it was Newman who noticed it first, some say it was Tuck, some say it was Tiltman, some say it was others. Notice that there's a very interesting feature of the psi stream. As I've said, it doesn't change every character, it stutters. And it only moves about 50% of the time, and it's controlled by those two middle wheels. Now, the guy who designed the Lorenz machine probably thought that was clever. And he probably thought that introduced a complication which increased the length of the cipher text, the key text, and allowed, made the machine much more complicated. In fact, it turns out that that is the tiniest of tiny, minuscule chinks in the armour of the Lorenz machine. And it is the one which Bletchley-Park set out to exploit. Because the fact that the psi wheels only change 50% of the time, and if you combine that with some knowledge of the exclusive OR operation, you can start to delete the effects of the machine very, very minutely. There's the exclusive OR operation. I'm sure you all know Carnot maps and truth tables. The carrierless binary addition exclusive OR, if you add 0, you do nothing. If you add something to itself, you always get 0. And if you add the same thing twice, then the second one undoes the first one. Okay, it's a reversible process. So Tuck noticed specifically that if you add something to itself, you get 0. And that has an effect. If you add subsequent characters in a string of messages that have been encrypted this way, if you add subsequent characters, what you end up doing is identifying repeats, because repeats result in a 0 in what they called the delta string. So this is the tricky part. Okay, this is the part that I managed to work out to my satisfaction. We'll see if it satisfies you. Plain text in German, in fact, and on a good link on a good day, contains a lot of repeated characters. German actually contains a lot more repeated characters than English does. It contains a lot, for instance, double M, double E, double T, double S. They are a feature of the German language. So it just so happens that German plain text contains a lot of repeats. Also, the teleprinter alphabet helps here too, because it's only an alphabetic alphabet. It has shift keys to allow you to generate punctuation and numbers. So if you want to generate a full stop, you type some letters and then you type a figure shift character, and you then type full stop, and you then type letter shift to go back to letters again. Now, in order to avoid those shift keys getting lost and resulting in garbage ever after, German operators fell into the habit of typing the shift key twice. So to enter a full stop, they would often enter the full stop twice too. So they would enter figure shift, full stop, left shift, left shift. 50% repeat in 6 characters. So they're actually helping here without realizing it. Now, then think about the psi wheels. We know the psi wheel contains about 50% repeats because it only moves half the time. So in any one bit position, you have about 70% repeats in any one bit position, because each bit position changes half the time. Okay? So we've got a lot of repeats here. How can we exploit and detect those? Well, we define what's called a delta stream. And to generate the delta stream, you just calculate successively the difference between successive characters in a string. And you discover that if you do that, in any 1-bit position, the plain text delta string, delta P, if you want to call it, is 60% zeros, which is slightly more than you would expect. Delta psi, the psi string, is about 70% zero, which is quite a lot of zeros in any 1-bit position. Now, you just got to remember that your ciphertext is plain text plus chi plus psi. And the delta is distributive over that, so the delta z is delta p plus delta chi plus delta psi. That's fine. Also, if you rearrange that, delta z, that's your ciphertext combined with the chi text, is the same as delta p plus delta psi. Right? And we know that delta p plus delta psi contains some repeats. So if you generate a candidate chi string, right, you guess at the chi string, and you delta that, and you combine it with the delta of the ciphertext, and you try all possible start positions for that, in the right start position, you will see very slightly too many zeros. Approximately 5% too many zeros on a good day, on a good link, with a good German operator. That's about as many as you will ever see. In many cases, you will see less than that. But it's a very, very tiny preponderance of zeros that you are looking for in delta z and delta chi. Now, remember, I told you delta chi had 22 million characters in its sequence. Now, in order to try a message, say 4,000 characters long, with every possible starting position of a 22 million long chi sequence, you'd have to try something like 22 billion combinations. Way too many. Way too many. So, what if you can do it with just a couple of the bits? And it turns out that you can. It turns out that this effect, this excess zero effect, is still there, even if you pick only 2 of the bits. So, in fact, they honed in on x0 and x1, or chi0 and chi1, the 2 bottom bits of the chi string. And that has a string length of 1,271 characters, which is a lot more manageable. So if you take that and a message of a similar length, 1,200 characters, it takes you 1.6 million operations to try that message against every possible start position of the chi string. And look for that tiny, tiny excess of zeros. And what you've done, getting from top to bottom of here, is reduce 7 times 10 to the 15 possibilities to try down to 1.6 million. Reduced it by a factor of over 1 trillion. Now, by hand, that would take a while. At 1 a second, my calculation says it would take about 18 days. They tried it at Bletchley Park. It took between 4 to 6 weeks, but it worked. And they were able, by hand, to break out messages by carrying out all of that analysis, all of that zero counting by hand. Now, a message that takes 4 to 6 weeks to break out is useless in intelligence terms. You have to get to messages faster than that, within days, if possible, within hours. So, if you could do those tests at 2,000 characters a second, then it would take about 14 minutes. Now, that's much more manageable. I'm introducing my 3rd Cambridge man. Cambridge 3, Oxford nil, right? This is Max Newman. Again, well known to all of you, I'm sure. Max Newman, again, had been at Bletchley for quite a long time, been involved with all kinds of things. I was involved with the analysis of the Lorenz cipher at this point. And between January and June 1943, he conceived and designed, and he had built a machine which would do just that. And it ran the tests at about 2,000 characters a second. And basically, he devised a machine where you punch your message on one tape and glue the tape into a loop, and you punched your candidate chi string onto another tape and glue it together in a loop, and you run the 2 tapes through a pair of tape readers, and with some clever, interesting combining circuitry in the middle that does the delta and the counting of zeros in the middle, you discover that you can do this very fast, about 2,000 characters a second. If you arrange for the lengths of the tape to be co-prime, then you just simply let the tape run. And every time the tape cycled through, it would start in a different position. And if you let it run long enough, it would cover all 1,271 possible start positions. And if your combining unit detected a peak of zeros at one particular point, that one would be flagged up. You take those little bits and you go off to your hand analysis people and you say, do you think those 2 bits work? And if they did, then you'd go on, set the machine up and try and break up the next 2 bits or the next 3 bits and so on. And here is a picture of that very machine. They called it Heath Robinson, after the cartoonist who specialised in drawing weird machines. And say it worked. And it made it possible to break out the chi wheel settings 2 bits at a time, and then the psi wheels and then the motor wheels would be broken out by hand, using hand analysis on paper. It ran, say, about 2,000 characters a second, and it completed an entire test run in about 15 minutes. It's very, very manageable. And Heath Robinson reduced the time taken to break one of these messages from 4 to 6 weeks down to a few days, which is useful, but still a little bit too long. There were other problems with Heath Robinson. It was hard to use, and there were problems with synchronizing tapes. No one really had ever tried running paper tape at 2,000 characters a second before, and keeping 2 tapes in exact synchrony at that speed was very difficult. Also, paper tapes tended to break at that speed, and the tapes would break and fly apart. Remember, the chi tapes would be reused against each message. And they, over time, they would stretch and they would break, and you would lose synchrony between them. Heath Robinson could really only help with breaking out just those bits of the chi wheels. It wasn't flexible enough to start helping with breaking out the psi wheels or any of the other settings. Another thing which the German operators were able to do with their Lorenz machine was not just change the initial settings of the wheels, but change the bit patterns on the edge of the wheel. And they did that about once every month for most of the war, and during the latter part of the war they did every week. So every week the entire chi string would change, and you would have to work it out all over again. And Heath Robinson was no help with that at all. So, all right, enter our final player, if you like. The combining unit, in the middle of that last slide, was designed and built by this chap, a young electronic engineer from the Post Office Research Establishment. He spent his life designing and building telephone exchanges. He had a background in mechanical engineering, which suited him well for mechanical telephone exchanges. And he actually took, in his own time, evening classes at University College London, here, UCL, in electronics. And over time convinced himself actually it would be possible to build an all-electronic telephone exchange out of valves, which were the available electronic switching elements of the time. But his managers didn't believe him, and they wouldn't let him try any of those ideas. So he built this combining unit, which is not particularly huge, out of a combination of vacuum tubes or valves and relays. When he saw the use that this machine was being put to, he realised entirely alone that there was a much, much better way of doing this. And he pitched to Max Newman, who was in charge of this, a really quite incredible idea. He pitched that he could design and build a machine. And this machine would generate the chi stream internally, no tapes, entirely automatically, using valve circuits, which could be programmed using wires and switches and so on, to generate any possible chi stream using any possible bit positions and any possible wheel settings. And it could also, internally, automatically carry out all this differencing, all this statistical analysis, and he even said you could connect it up to a typewriter, teleprinter, and it would print the results out, rather than someone having to stop the machine and write them down by hand and then rush off to the analysis room. Now, Newman was very interested, but not really totally convinced. So Flowers went away. Whether he was sent away or went away depends on which account you read. But he went back, at any event, to Dollis Hill, the research establishment. And he came back to Bletchley about 6 months later with a lorry. And on the back of that lorry was a machine. Some pictures of Colossus, which I'm sure you've seen. These are some original pictures which, as these things have a habit of doing, did survive. Colossus was 7 feet long, 16 feet long in the other way, and 2 feet wide, so 7 feet high. Constructed from, at that stage, 1,500 valves. Colossus Mark II, shortly afterwards, had 2,400 valves in it, and it processed text at about 5,000 characters a second. Colossus II was 5 times faster. And that meant running the tape at about 30 miles an hour, 40 feet per second. running the tape through. Now, Colossus itself, in its circuitry, could actually cope faster than that. It could actually read at 10,000 characters a second, but they discovered that the tape disintegrated at 53 miles an hour. So actually, they couldn't run Colossus as fast as it could be. Not the first time, I think, that a computer has been limited by the speed of its input device. Think about that. But Colossus was massively parallel. And it was capable of processing all 5 channels at once, with up to 100 billion calculations simultaneously on each of those 5 channels. And Bletchley Park deciphered over 63 million characters of traffic using Colossus. Now, if you compare it to Heath Robinson, the machine that Newman designed, it wasn't just faster. It could do so much more. Being configurable and programmable, it could help with determining the starting positions of the Chi wheels, but also the side wheels and the motor wheels. And when the operators, say as they did once every month and then once every week, changed the bit patterns on all the wheels, Colossus could help decode those new bit patterns as well. And you didn't have to blow new tapes with it, you just reprogrammed its generator circuits and it generated a completely new size stream. Heath Robinson just had to start all over again. Flower's machine did it all automatically. If you look this is a page, a fantastic page from Flower's diary, which I know who has Flower's diary, but apparently I'm not allowed to tell you. But this is Flower's diary. You look, Sunday the 16th of January 1944 made Colossus work. Tuesday the 19th, Colossus delivered to Bletchley Park. 7 words, really. Not a man of great length, Mr. Flowers, but that's fairly momentous, isn't it? But even more momentous is if you look at this entry from the 5th of February 1944. Colossus did its first job. Right? That's 5 words that really represents the birth of electronic computing, as far as I'm concerned. But even better, if you look at the entry just underneath here, it says, car broke down on the way home. Picked up by farthing in the radio car. But yeah, there we go. Even great innovators have their car problems. So you could design great machines but couldn't fix a car. But anyway, so let's turn to Colossus. Because Flowers, I think, obviously, possibly at this point, didn't really appreciate what he'd done. You can see by the brevity of his diary entries. I'm not quite sure he understood really what he'd achieved. There's a block diagram of the Colossus architecture. On the face of it looks very simple. But you can clearly see, running right through it horizontally, you can see the parallelism. Processing all 5 bit streams all at once. And one very clever touch was to make the machine essentially self-timing. You can see this note here, sprocket hole pulses for timing. And if you look at teleprinter tape, as well as the 5 rows of holes which encode the characters, you know, it's little string of holes, tiny holes down the middle, which are the sprocket holes. And they engage with a little tooth gear to drive the tape through a mechanical reader. Now, in Colossus, they actually drove the tape using a friction drive through an optical reader. So they didn't need the sprocket holes to do that. But what Flowers did, very cleverly, was put another optical sensor underneath the sprocket hole and use that to generate a clock signal, which drove the entire machine. So rather than having to work to synchronize the tapes with the machine automatically synchronized itself to the tape. No matter how fast the tape ran, no matter how stretched the tape became, the machine synchronized itself to the tape. Very, very clever idea. And if you look at some of the other innovations that Flowers came up with, it's the first recorded use of what we now know as shift registers. He also came up with something at the bottom here called systolic arrays. These are arrays where the processing of input values depends on the current values held within the array. It's a very clever combination of data and computation. And these were actually independently discovered. If you search the literature on these, you discover a paper published in 1973 purporting to have discovered systolic arrays. Flowers designed them in total secrecy all by himself in 1943, and unfortunately never got to tell anyone about it. Let's say a single clock used to synchronize the entire machine. It was a huge breakthrough, massively parallel machine, and I think it really embodied what I would call interrupts. As I say, Colossus would connect to a teleprinter, and when it detected a peak in zeros or something interesting, it would output the current settings to a teleprinter and type them out. And at the same time, it would carry on trying further settings to see if there were other possible hits on this particular run. And if it found another run before the teleprinter had finished printing out the last one, the teleprinter would send out a little signal back to Colossus and say, whoa, stop, I haven't finished. And Colossus would switch into an idle state, just cycling its tapes at idle, and wait for the teleprinter to finish, then output, and then go and carry on. Now, if that is an interrupt, isn't an interrupt, I don't know what is. So he seems to have come up really independently with the concept of interrupts. So an optical paper tape reader capable of up to 10,000 characters per second. That had never been done before either. When the first time I can remember coming across computers, when I started secondary school in 1976, we used teletypes with a little little tape reader on the side that ran at 110 baud. What's that? 8 characters a second. 8 characters a second. We had a really fast one for loading the compiler that ran at 4,800 baud, whatever that is, about 500 characters a second. 60 years before that, there's Flowers running a machine, running a reader at 10,000 characters a second. An incredible innovation. So its clock speed, so it was about 5 kilohertz, the speed that they ran the tape safely at. And it carried out about 100 billion operations simultaneously on each bit in the bit stream. And just for fun, I kind of defined by a unit here of billion operations per second, which is a bot. And a megabot would be 1 million of those. And by a rough calculation, Colossus was capable of carrying out about 2.5 million billion operations per second. 2.5 megabots. Not bad, as far as I'm concerned, for a machine designed and built in 1944. It's quite staggering, really. But what of its impact? Did it do what it was supposed to do? Was it worth it? Because it's a huge task. By the end of the war, they built many, many more of these. They built 10 to 12 of them by the end of the war. Did it achieve what it was supposed to do? Well, Flowers and the team were put under huge pressure, massive pressure, to have their machine operational by June 1944. They had no idea why. Now, looking back, we know exactly why. Because we know that Eisenhower and the Allied command were planning, and had been planning for a very long time, the re-invasion of the European mainland. That operation that we now know as D-Day. And it was planned for June 1944. And you cannot really comprehend, at this distance, I don't think we can understand how much rested on that operation succeeding. How much energy and effort and money and men and machines had been invested in this one day, this one operation. It was incredibly risky. As a very, very heavily defended coastline and an enemy who knew that one day they were coming. So they put a huge deception plan in place, and much has been written about that, including much more quite recently. There were fake army groups, fictitious intelligence, false plans which were accidentally lost and left for the Germans to find, to convince the Nazi command that the invasion would not come in Normandy, but it would come instead in Calais. And the success of that deception was really vital to the whole D-Day concept. So knowing that the Nazi authorities had been deceived was very, very important. And here, Colossus did play its part. Because with the scheduling of D-Day, we had the weather, the season, the tide, and the moon, and all sorts of other things, but principally those four, meant that there was a window just of a few days each month when they stood a realistic chance of succeeding. So when the tide and the moon and so on actually all aligned. And delaying by more than 4 or 5 days meant waiting a month for the window to open again. Delaying more than 2 or 3 months from June would bring it into winter, and they would have to wait a year. So launching that operation in June 1944 became incredibly, incredibly important. And it was vital that they had intelligence to tell them about Nazi thinking. And the original date, we are told, for D-Day was June the 1st. It was delayed to June the 2nd, and then to the 3rd, and then to the 4th, and then to the 5th. June the 6th represented the final opportunity that month to launch. And on June the 5th, the evening of June the 5th, Eisenhower met with his generals to make a decision, knowing that this was the last opportunity to go before the following month. And as they were meeting, a courier arrived from Bletchley Park with some freshly decoded signals, entered the room and handed Eisenhower a folded piece of paper. Eisenhower opened it and read it, didn't show it to anybody, but read it, and what he read was a message that had been decrypted a few hours earlier by a Colossus machine at Bletchley Park, and it was from Hitler in Berlin to Rommel, the commander of the Nazi forces in France, and it stated categorically that Hitler's belief was that the invasion, there would be an invasion in Normandy, but it would be a feint. And the real invasion would happen some days later in Calais, and anything in Normandy would be a diversion, and he specifically refused Rommel permission to move his heavy tank divisions and other support forces from Calais to Normandy. Eisenhower read that. He realised it was exactly what he'd been waiting for. It was total confirmation that the Nazi command from Hitler downwards were totally deceived as to the Allied plans, at the timing and the location of the attack. And without revealing what he'd read, because he couldn't, Eisenhower simply folded the paper up, so we are told, looked at the assembled group of generals and said, "Gentlemen, we go tomorrow." And so they did. We know the 6th of June, the invasion went ahead, the largest seaborne invasion in history, hopefully never to be repeated, and the war ended almost exactly a year later. We know that Churchill credited Bletchley Park with winning the war in some respects. And nowhere does that come down to more than this statement here. Churchill was terrified of the U-boat peril. He was terrified of losing the war at the Atlantic because he realised that starving Britain to death was the easiest way to get Britain out of the war, and the U-boat threat was what would do that. So Churchill acknowledged the debt that Britain and the rest of the world owed to the efforts of Bletchley Park. That includes the efforts against Colossus that we've just seen. It is estimated, as we said right at the beginning, that the decryption of German ciphers shortened the war by anything up to 2 years and saved hundreds of thousands of lives. In research, I uncovered one amazing piece of luck, as reported by Tommy Flowers himself. He was in Berlin on post office business just a few days before hostilities broke out at the beginning of the war. And he was called by the British Embassy when hostilities broke out and was told to return home immediately. And he crossed into Holland hours before they shut the border. If the Germans had interned him, what would have happened? There would possibly have been no one at the post office and no one subsequently at Bletchley Park with the knowledge of mechanical and electrical technology that Flowers managed to synthesize, and possibly no one with the imagination and the foresight to build what became Colossus. It is staggering to think that the Germans had the author of their downfall in their grasp, and they let him go with hours to spare. And what happened to it all? So we kind of finally come to the legacy of Colossus, really. We know that immediately following the war, Churchill specifically ordered that Colossus and all memory of it be destroyed. He used the famous phrase that it should be broken up into pieces no bigger than a man's hand. And Tommy Flowers, and I cannot begin to imagine what went through his mind and his heart while he was doing this. Tommy Flowers supervised the destruction, and he wrote after the war, what a terrible mistake it was. He said, "I was instructed to destroy all the records, and I did that. I took all the drawings, and I took all the plans and all the information about Colossus on paper, and I put it in the boiler fire, and I watched it burn." Quite astonishing to watch someone, for someone to be ordered really to destroy so many years' work and so much investment. Heartbreaking. But we do know that 2 of the Colossus machines were not actually destroyed. They were moved to GCHQ at Eastkirk in April 1946. They were then moved to Cheltenham sometime in the early 50s. We know that one of them was dismantled in 1959. We know the other was dismantled in 1960. UK intelligence kept them because after the war we used Enigma and Lorenz type machines and we promoted those and we sold them to other governments without ever revealing to them that we could actually read everything they were doing, because the secrecy in which we treated this. As all digital encryption schemes became much more common through the 60s, the need for that faded. The Colossus machines were got rid of. The first books to describe what happened at Bletchley started to come out in the early 70s. Enigma work was described in 1973, famously in the Hot Set story, for which the government were not too pleased that these stories were being told. But later books started to hint at the existence of a much greater secret at Bletchley Park, not just Enigma but something else. Firm evidence and details about Colossus didn't emerge until it was the American authorities published under their Freedom of Information legislation a report written by the American Secret Service into Colossus, and they published that in 2000. Really caught our government off the foot, off the hoof, because our government hadn't authorised any disclosure on this. But until that point, officially, Colossus had been kept a secret, essentially, for well over 50 years. Its existence was entirely covered up. But we also know that parts of it, which had been carefully sanitized, were sent to Max Newman's computing machine laboratory at Manchester University, where he designed what we now know as the Manchester Baby, the Manchester Mark I, the first operational stored program computer in the world. And that ran on June the 21st, 1948, which is not really a very long time after the war. Now, Newman knew about Colossus. He'd seen it. He'd seen it designed. He'd seen it work. He knew that large-scale, high-speed computing machinery like that could be built using the technology of the time. Not many other people knew that, but Newman had seen it. And I personally find it inconceivable that he didn't take that knowledge with him to Manchester. Along with, we know he took bits of Colossus with him, and I'm quite sure, and I think it's without doubt to me, that he used that experience and that knowledge directly in the work which he conducted at Manchester immediately after the war. So if we look at conventional history of computing, as handed down by word of mouth, by conventional wisdom, the conventional history of computing will mention a machine called EDVAC. EDVAC was designed by the late great John von Neumann, and it certainly had the greatest influence on early architectures. But EDVAC wasn't delivered until 1949. It wasn't operational until 1951. Then you have the Manchester Baby, or the small-scale experimental machine, as Newman's team called it. That first ran on the 21st of June 1948, and that certainly is the first stored program computer. EDSAC from Cambridge followed very, very shortly afterwards, May 6, 1949, with his slightly separate design. Now, another machine is often mentioned, ENIAC, and that's often credited with being the first operational computer. But it wasn't really programmable. It was programmable in the same sense, in many ways, that Colossus was. It certainly wasn't what we would call Turing complete. And most importantly, for our purposes, it was not operational until February 1946. That somewhat changes things. Here is a picture that I found in a US publication from 1957, purporting to show a family tree of all computing devices up to that time. And you can see it recognises ENIAC and EDVAC really as kind of the root of the main elements, if you like, in the evolution of digital computing. Now, Colossus may not have been Turing complete, but neither was the machine that they all cite as the forerunner of EDVAC, something called the Harvard Mark I. And that was completed in February 1944. It first ran computations in May that year. It was delivered in August 1944, and it wasn't Turing complete. And remember, ENIAC didn't come until the 14th of February in 1946. Colossus predates everything on that diagram. Everything. It doesn't appear on that diagram, say in 1957. It wouldn't appear in history texts until any time really in the last 15 years after the turn of the millennium. Because at that time, Colossus was secret, its existence was completely unknown. It would remain a secret after that point for another 40 years. Flowers, tragically, because of this, as we now know, was really denied his true place in history because of that. He ended the war by many accounts in debt because he'd used some of his own money to buy components to complete his Colossus design, while others like Newman went into academic fields and actually utilised the technology that Flowers had proved, if you like, went into academic fields and were recognised as pioneers in computing. Flowers remained in the shadows. He returned to the telephone research laboratory at Dollis Hill, where the managers still wouldn't let him build electronic telephone exchanges because they still wouldn't believe that you could build large-scale valve machines. Flowers, because he had vowed to remain secret, didn't tell them that last year he'd done it, which is very, very sad. The best thing, though, about Colossus, which I'm sure you all know, is you can still see it. You can still see it, or a version of it, in action. Although all of those extant machines were destroyed either immediately or shortly after the war, all the drawings and the plans were burned. When the existence of Colossus re-emerged, one man, known, I'm sure personally to many in this room, undertook to bring it back to life. And in the late 1990s, really before the existence of Colossus had been officially confirmed at all, Tony Sale founded a project to rebuild a working replica of Colossus, and he used fragments of drawings which had survived. It's amazing, isn't it, how engineers always keep things. Always. Show me an engineer that does not have a drawer in his study with things he never thinks he'll use again. Tony Sale went around gathering little memories, little fragments of drawings, pictures, and through that completed a rebuild in November 2007. And if you go to Bletchley Park today, you can see it. A wonderful, wonderful memorial to a wonderful piece of engineering. And what you can see, and if you're lucky, touch at Bletchley, is a machine that really, really did change history. It's a machine that represents the birth of an entire industry. It's the industry that I'm privileged to work in, and which all of us have spent various parts of our lives working in. And that industry today touches and changes the lives of almost every single person on this planet in a way that I think no other industry has really done. And it's a privilege to work in it. I, for one, am extremely glad that Colossus now has its place in history. Here for your delighted delectation, some pictures of the reconstruction of Bletchley Park. And I'm deeply satisfied, really deeply satisfied, that a man by the name of Tommy Flowers can be recognised as one of the truly great innovators in our industry. So by way of dedication, because I think it's fitting, very sadly, everybody involved in this story has now passed on. Almost all of them, in fact, sadly, before the existence of Colossus was confirmed and before they could be recognised for it. The 12,000 people who worked at Bletchley Park and kept the secret. Churchill famously talked about the goose that laid the golden egg and never cackled. And there are stories of people who lived the rest of their lives never telling their spouse what they had done at Bletchley Park. Remember Bill Tutt, who sadly died in 2002 in Canada, who really broke the machine. That incredible feat of mental analysis, totally unaided, which gave Bletchley the way in to the machine. Tommy Flowers, who died in 1998, never ever recognised for his achievement because nobody knew what he'd done and he was too honourable to tell anyone. Max Newman died in 1984, who won the post-war race to build the first electronic computer in the world at Manchester. And finally to Tony Sale, who sadly left us just 3 or 4 years ago, who really brought it all to life again and allows another generation to experience just what Colossus achieved.
Chris, thank you for that. I'm sure there are many questions, comments and so on from the floor. I see Brian Randall's hand is up there. I think possibly preeminent probably in this room for his contribution to bringing the story into the public space.
That was quite a true thought. Thank you.
Thank you.
However, I would like to offer a correction.
Please.
the government admitted the existence of Colossus, and named Tommy Flowers and others in 1975. The first photograph that you showed was one of 6 that was issued in 1975. I was then permitted to interview and to document the story of Colossus. So Tommy Flowers and others started to get publicity. It's not quite as sad as you said. They deserved a lot more, and they're starting to get it now. But really, the government had very much admitted Colossus. What they had not admitted was what Colossus was for. The paper that I was allowed to publish was censored in the sense that even though the paper started talking about the books like The Ultra Secret and Bodyguard of Lies, when it went on to talk about Colossus, it was only permitted to talk about Colossus as a machine which solved a problem. There's nothing in my paper which explicitly says that Colossus was anything to do with code breaking. Certainly Colossus had been publicised, Tommy Flowers' role had been publicised, and I'm very proud that my university gave me an honorary doctorate in 1977.
Too late, no, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That was absolutely fascinating. Given that the early Enigma machines were so complex, and it was so implausible that anybody could possibly break through, why did the Germans keep increasing the level of security, the number of wheels and so on?
That I don't know, and others may be able to chip in on that. I don't know. It's possible that they began to suspect that we were directing operations in the North Atlantic with a little bit too much luck. They began to suspect that.
Such as that chart of Colossus.
So, comment on that. Enigma's only good for up to a couple of hundred characters for a message. When you go longer than that, you've got problems. And so, because you can easily make numbers to fight the big number, with only 17,500 rows of positions, everything else staying the same, that gives you some sort of indication that if you're dealing with big messages, you need something in a different loop.
Thank you.
Right.
Brian Wishman here. Just to say that Tommy Flowers did give an explanation about his work. Exactly what he said, unfortunately my memory is not good enough to relate, but one thing I remember very well was that he said that his work showed that if you could switch the machine off, the valve type machines that he was working with would be reliable enough to do what was required.
Yes, he's often cited as that was one of his great breakthroughs, and one realisation was that people said you couldn't build a machine that large with that many valves because the failure rate of valves was too high. And if you put more than a few hundred valves in a machine, it would fail several times a day just because valves would burn out. And Flowers realised that most of the stress there was when you powered the valves on and off. And by leaving them on constantly, you could massively extend the life of a valve, and he designed that into Colossus.
I think I've read that it's believed that the Russians used the Lorenz machines from ones they captured from the Germans towards the end of the war. If that was the case and they were using them, I wonder if we were already at that stage listening into what they were saying, and that's hence another reason for their very high security.
Yes.
Could you possibly
another
comment?
reason for us to hang on to it. Yes, absolutely. Yes. So certainly we did not divulge to the Russians that we could read it. Definitely not. No. I don't think we told them we could break Enigma either.
Well, no, but they seem to have a
So
certain
we told
amount
them
of people who would tell them.
The trouble
Jim?
was Russia had a spy in
Cairn Cross was there, yes.
Could you outline the differences between Colossus Mark I and Mark II?
I don't know enough
Apart
about
from the performance and the number.
I don't know enough about the internal architecture of Colossus to do that. It may be that I've read it somewhere, but I don't have that in my head. I should say, Roger was asking me what is my connection with Colossus. I actually don't have a connection with Colossus at all, other than a total fascination with it when I first discovered and first started reading about it. I have no personal connection with it. I've never worked with it. I've never really worked with anyone who did either. So everything I've found out has been sort of purely as a result of a hobby fascination, which has been wonderful to pursue.
May I attempt an answer to that question? The Colossus Mark I, which I think Flowers always regarded as the prototype, essentially processed one row of 5 bits of tape at a time. The Colossus, the Mark II, the production machines, they essentially quintupled that electronics, introduced the use of shift registers, and essentially were working on 5 rows at a time. And so by the time you read those 5 rows, you had done 5 times as much analysis as the prototype could have done.
That makes lots of sense.
The other thing is that Mickey and Good, Donald Mickey and I.J. Good, who did a lot of work on the initial Colossus and developed techniques, well, on the Robinsons and then on Colossus, developed techniques for using it, realized that by essentially fiddling with the machine as it worked, we're able to not only work on wheel setting but wheel braking.
Yes. Yes.
So the notion of being able to work out how the cams were set on,
yes.
on the wheels was a totally novel problem, or at least certainly something that had not been planned when Colossus started.
The Colossus was flexible enough to be able to be adapted for that, yes, to be able to break out the pins on the wheels.
They were doing things by, I'm not quite sure how, but anyway, manipulating the machine while it worked, and the later production machines incorporated more electronics so that what they were doing by hand now no longer needed to be done by hand. But in fact, in all probability, none of those 10 machines were exactly the same. They were developing all the time and introducing new things.
That doesn't surprise me.
Certainly a massively different machine, 2,500 valves instead of 1,500 valves, because of that 5-fold parallels.
Yes, that does make sense, because I do know that one of the things that Colossus Mark II could do, which Mark I couldn't do, was deal with more than just adjacent characters. It could do with characters spaced 2, 3, 4, 5 apart, and actually find sequences of characters which were not just restricted to adjacent characters. So it could find, shift characters which were separated by 1, for instance, and all kinds of other interesting combinations.
Just a quick comment. I hesitate to say anything to this audience, but my recollection was that the Germans at least twice did investigate in depth whether the Enigma had been broken, and I believe concluded on a balance of probabilities that bad luck and espionage were more probable than that this machine had been broken. I suspect the statistics were probably right, but the conclusion was wrong.
Yes, they did conclude that it couldn't be done, or hadn't been done.
Hi. May I say that that's the best exposition of Colossus that I have ever heard, and well done. Perhaps I could give notice that afterwards in the pub, I'd like to talk to you about Manchester.
Oh,
I point out that as a research student, I did use a bit of the baby machine, 1 rack and 1 50-volt power supply. So I know a little bit about what happened to those bits.
Absolutely, yes. Yes, thank you.
I also recollect in about 1946 or 47 at a conference that Jack Good, in answer to a question, said that he had recent experience of very large valve machines, which if you didn't turn them off, ran successfully, and that was just a comment made by him, which is...
That's a very naughty thing to say, yes.
Well, it's in the... I mean, Martin Campbell-Kelly would be able to tell us, I've forgotten the conference where he said that, but it's in.
It's in a number of places actually.
Ah.
It's in the course of the lectures.
Yes.
Actually.
Ah, okay. Sorry.
The first people from the post office having visited.
Yes.
Is it known whether Flowers cooperated with you at Manchester leading up to 48?
To my knowledge, I think I read somewhere, and I'm sure others can put it, that Newman did want to employ Flowers, but the post office wouldn't release it. Is that correct? I believe that's correct. Yes, either that or possibly it's Turing wanted to employ Flowers on the ACE machine, which he built at the National Physics Laboratory. And again, the post office wouldn't release it.
One of the reasons that Pegasus was so successful was because with the valves, they ran them up slowly. It took 2 minutes to put power, and that made a tremendous difference to the life of the machine.
Yeah.
Just follow up on this number of valves. On the number of valves issue, I think it's Jack Copeland's edited book. It's got various chapters by various folks like himself. I think in one of those chapters it suggests that Flowers had already done his development work in 1933 to 34, a piece of kit with 4,000 valves in it. And so that wouldn't be a particular secret. So I think there wouldn't be an issue in letting that cat out of the bag.
Could you pass that microphone forward?
Just heard you mention ACE, knowing that Alan Turing worked at NPL for 2 years. Was he connected with the development of the ACE induced valve machines at NPL?
Who? Turing.
Yeah.
Turing designed the ACE machine, as I understand it. I haven't researched that. Turing designed the ACE machine, but eventually gave it up because they didn't want to build it the way he designed it. And then he relocated to Manchester after a while, and spent a long time associated to Newman's laboratory, but became increasingly sidelined with it because his ideas diverged from the way that Newman and his team wanted to take it. And he eventually diverged himself into things like mathematical biology rather than computing. And the mathematics of cognition, he got very well.
Was Professor Williams at Manchester at the time you're talking about? Yeah.
Yes. Simon is being too modest, and not everybody can go to the pub with it. I think the issue of the extent to which Newman influenced the work at Manchester, which was really led by Williams and Kilburn, is, let me just say, something that can be discussed.
This distance, yes.
Credited Newman with describing to him how a computer worked, in the sense of you had these little boxes and information flow from one to another and things like that. But Williams and Kilburn had the whole radar establishment behind them. They, I think, got a lot of equipment from the radar world. I don't
Specifically a lot of CRT tubes, yeah.
I don't know to what extent, if at all, what was obtained by Newman for his mathematical lab influenced what was done in electrical engineering by Williams and Kilburn. Sorry, Simon, but you can talk about something else.
I add a little to that. Most people know me and Andrew Herbert. We're doing the EDSAC reconstruction. The person behind that was Maurice Wills, who also came from the School of British Wartime Radar, and is very straightforward on the influence of his radar experience, generating pulses, counting, and so forth. That gives him an overlap certainly with Williams, who he knew. And there is an early textbook from the MIT Radiation Lab with Williams as an author. I think it's volume 19 in the series, which I forget the precise title, but it boils down to computing with waveforms. And in there he's talking about how to build electronic circuits that add, count, subtract, and measure. And And so there's a strand of computing that comes through from the radar world. And in some sense, if your tree is one of influence, that radar path is one way you can track the things coming together. But they didn't have the stored program idea, and maybe that came through one way actually. But certainly the idea of circuits to produce what we would now describe as digital logic came out of the radar world, as well as the work that Flowers did. It was influenced by his telephony.
I think one of certainly my reading of it was one of the biggest problems that held up so many of those teams for so long in the early days was just simply the problem of storage. And they solved it in different ways. And Wilson's team solved it with Mercury, and Manchester solved it with CRT displays and so on.
Mercury lines are a radar technology.
Yes, so all of that is quite obviously radar technology, I think, all of it.
This is Chris Little from the Met Office. Just going back to the thing about the valve. When the Met Office got its first computer, which is a Mercury, the availability of the machine, they're doing trials, like 6-month trials, to see whether it can actually beat the forecasters, the word forecasting. And the availability of the machine was about 2/3. A third of the time they got the forecast by the deadline, a third of the time they missed the deadline, and a third of the time the machine didn't work. And then they started using the forecasts from human forecasters saying it's going to be a very cold night. They would then decide to leave the machine switched on.
Yeah, just to go back on that point about the reliability of valves, perhaps worth noting that when Tony rebuilt Colossus, obviously we didn't have the luxury of leaving it running 24/7 because we have electricity bills to pay. So we used that technique of ramping up the heaters slowly in the rebuilt Colossus, which I assume wasn't present on the original based on the comments that we made about needing to move them on at the time.
Sorry, I'm making David walk along my side. I'm standing here behind a modern digital camera, but somewhere in the depths of our archive we have a tape of one of our first meetings where we had Maurice Wilkes, Tom Kilburn, people from NPL, etc., etc. And the thing I remember from it was Maurice Wilkes in Maurice Wilkes fashion, saying, well, I never worked for the post office and I wasn't too sure about this. Instead of using 16-inch racks, we'll use 22-inch racks. And that was almost, he threw that out, certainly at that meeting, as part of the design concept, that he'd do it differently because he hadn't worked for the post office. But there you are.
I think perhaps that's the point at which we I won't say close, I suspect simply press the pause button on this, because certainly some people will be heading down to the pub by South Kensington Station for a little refreshment, and certainly to continue the discussion. Chris, can I thank you very much indeed for a fascinating afternoon, and we all, I'm sure, have been much stimulated by what you said, and also our understanding has been much increased, as Simon said. And Simon, I'm sure, has heard a great many of these lectures on this topic. It was a very clear presentation, so we're most grateful for that. Can I just briefly say that our next meeting on November the 19th is on the history of primary healthcare computing, so a completely different topic. December the 17th is our Christmas film show of old films featuring computers, and the first meeting in the new year, January 21st, may well be of interest to people interested in Bletchley Park. We got Dermot Turing coming to talk about the unknown Turing. I invited him to come, not knowing he was publishing a book. He probably accepted, knowing that he had written most of the book, and it would have been published. So this may well not be disconnected to his reason for his acceptance of the invitation, but he's very heavily involved, as many here know, with the bomb rebuild, and he's a trustee of Bletchley Park, so that my comment is perhaps slightly unkind, but we are looking forward very much to that. But if you want to have an opportunity to discuss Bletchley Park and its wartime activities further, January the 21st, and we expect that meeting to be here. So we hope that you'll be able to come to our next meeting, and we look forward to seeing you then, and particularly the January meeting, we look forward to seeing you there. So thank you very much indeed. In particular, oh, he's disappeared. Chris, take a final bow. Chris, a great afternoon. Thank you very much.